You keep waking up with a weight in your chest before anyone has even said a word to you. The room is quiet, your phone is face down, and somehow you already feel the pressure of conversations you have not answered, decisions you have postponed, and people you no longer know how to explain yourself to. You stare at unread messages, not because you are cruel, but because something in you knows that responding the old way will pull you back into noise you barely survived. There was a time when you could fill every silence with music, scrolling, calls, plans, advice, distractions, anything that kept you from being alone with what God had been trying to show you. But now the distractions are losing their grip. The friendships that once kept you busy feel strangely hollow. The places where you used to laugh now make you feel like you are standing outside your own life. Even your prayers have changed. You do not have a long list anymore. Sometimes you only sit there and breathe because the truth is too close to dress up. This is not always punishment. This is not proof that you have been forgotten. Sometimes God begins to answer by removing the voices that kept interrupting the answer. Sometimes he does not send a thunderous sign. He lets the room become still enough for your own soul to stop performing. And when that happens, it can feel like rejection before it feels like mercy. It can feel like people are leaving, doors are closing, timing is failing, and your heart is growing heavier for no reason. But beneath all of that, there may be a holy separation taking place, not to make you lonely, but to make you honest. God may be stripping away the noise so you can finally recognize what you have been avoiding, the decision you keep delaying, the relationship that keeps draining your peace, the calling you keep minimizing, the habit you keep protecting, the grief you keep pretending does not still speak. A chosen person often thinks they are being hidden because nobody sees them, when in reality, God is allowing the hidden place to show them what they could not see while everyone was watching. The hardest part is that silence does not announce itself as protection. It usually arrives looking like disappointment. Someone who used to check on you suddenly becomes brief. A plan you were counting on falls apart without a dramatic reason. A door you prayed over stays closed. Not once, but repeatedly, until you begin to wonder whether you heard God wrong. And then the enemy takes that empty space and starts whispering interpretations that sound almost reasonable. Maybe you are too difficult. Maybe God is tired of your weakness. Maybe everyone else is moving forward because you missed your chance. That is where spiritual warfare often becomes subtle. It does not always come as chaos. Sometimes it comes as a story you start telling yourself while you are tired. You begin to read distance as rejection, delay as denial, correction as condemnation, and stillness as abandonment. But there is another possibility, one that requires more humility than panic. Maybe God is not trying to crush you. Maybe he is trying to interrupt the pattern before it becomes your identity. Maybe the people becoming distant are not all enemies, and maybe the doors closing are not all attacks. Some were distractions, some were attachments, some were paths that looked harmless but kept you from listening. You may have prayed for clarity while still keeping 10 voices around you that benefited from your confusion. You may have asked God to lead you while still asking everyone else to approve the direction. So he begins to quiet the circle, not because he hates the people around you, but because he knows how easily your heart starts obeying the loudest person in the room. This kind of separation can hurt because it touches the places where you have built comfort around being needed. It exposes the part of you that would rather be exhausted and included than rested and misunderstood. And that exposure is not cruel. It is surgical. God is careful with what he removes, but he is not casual about what is destroying you. He will not always explain the removal before he begins it, because if he explained everything first, you might negotiate with him instead of surrendering. There is a difference between being isolated by fear and being separated by God, and discernment begins when you stop romanticizing your pain long enough to examine its fruit. Fearful isolation makes you suspicious, bitter, obsessed, and unreachable. God-led separation makes you sober, tender, clearer, and more aware of what needs healing. Fear tells you to disappear so no one can hurt you again. God's quietness teaches you how to stop abandoning yourself just to keep access to people who only recognize the version of you that never says no. You can see the difference in simple moments. You're invited somewhere you used to attend without thinking, and before replying, you feel that small resistance in your spirit. Not dramatic, not angry, just firm. You imagine the same conversations, the same jokes that cost you your peace, the same pressure to pretend you are fine, and you realize you do not hate those people, but you cannot keep shrinking to stay familiar. That realization can make you feel guilty, especially if you were taught that love means endless availability. But love without obedience becomes a trap. Compassion without boundaries becomes exhaustion. And loyalty without discernment becomes a slow spiritual damage. If that truth finds you in a place you have been too tired to describe, let this video have your like as a quiet agreement, not as a performance, but as a small mark that you are willing to stop calling every boundary selfish. The chosen life is not about acting untouchable. It is about learning when God is asking you to step back before your spirit becomes numb. You may still pray for people from a distance. You may still wish them well. You may still feel sadness when the group chat goes quiet or when you see photos from rooms you used to belong to. But sadness does not mean you are supposed to return. Missing a place does not mean that place was healthy. Missing a person does not mean God is telling you to chase them. Sometimes your heart grieves what your spirit has already outgrown. That grief is real, but it is not always instruction. Sometimes it is simply the sound of an old version of you leaving the room. What makes this season confusing is that nothing may look obviously wrong from the outside. You may still have responsibilities, work to do, bills to pay, family to answer, a life that appears normal enough that nobody understands why you have become quieter. You show up to work, sit through meetings, answer what is necessary, and carry on like your inner world is not being rearranged. Someone asks, "Are you okay?" And you say, "I'm just tired," because telling the full truth would take too long. How do you explain that the same conversations that once entertained you now make your spirit restless? How do you explain that your ambition has not disappeared, but your motives are being questioned by God in the private place? How do you explain that you are not sad in the usual way, yet you keep feeling as if something old is ending before something new has been named? This is where many chosen people misread the process. They think because God is quiet, they must produce noise to prove they are still progressing. They start forcing plans, reopening doors, checking on people who already showed them where they stand, applying pressure to situations that God has allowed to pause. But the pause is often part of the message. Delay can reveal what desire hides. A closed door can expose whether you wanted God's will or only God's approval on your will. Silence can show you which voices you depended on more than His. And the heaviness you feel may not be a sign that you are failing. It may be the discomfort of no longer being able to live divided. One part of you wants to obey. Another part wants to keep the familiar arrangement because at least you knew how to survive there. That inner conflict is not proof you are unspiritual. It is evidence that your soul is being asked to choose alignment over habit. God does not need to shame you to lead you, but He will let certain things become uncomfortable enough that you can no longer call them peace. The message God is trying to get through may not be new. It may be something He has been repeating through patterns you kept explaining away. You noticed how drained you felt after certain calls, but you told yourself you were just sensitive. You noticed how your body tightened before meeting someone, but you called it anxiety and ignored the warning. You noticed how every time you tried to move toward a certain plan, confusion multiplied instead of peace deepening, but you kept pushing because you had already told people what you wanted. You noticed that one opportunity looked impressive, yet required you to compromise the quiet conviction you had prayed for. You noticed that someone's words were spiritual, but their actions kept producing fear, pressure, and instability. These are not small things. God often teaches discernment through repetition before He gives final clarity. He lets you see the same fruit in different seasons until you stop arguing with what is being revealed. But discernment is not suspicion. It is not assuming everyone has hidden motives. It is not stalking someone's behavior, interpreting every post as a message, or turning your emotions into prophecy. Real discernment brings you closer to God's character. It produces patience, self-control, wisdom, and peace that does not depend on controlling the outcome. If a connection is truly aligned with God, it will not require you to lose your mind to keep it. It will not demand manipulation, panic, secret monitoring, or constant decoding. It will be tested through consistency, humility, truth, and time. And if God is removing noise, He may also be removing your addiction to intensity. Some people mistake chaos for chemistry because chaos feels familiar. Some mistake uncertainty for mystery because it gives them something to chase. But God's guidance does not need confusion to feel deep. He can lead through a calm conviction that remains steady after the emotion settles. He can close a door without making you hate the person behind it. He can redirect you without making you dramatic. When the noise fades, you begin to realize that not every strong feeling is a sign. Sometimes it is a wound asking to be healed before it chooses again. There is a kind of hidden preparation that looks unimpressive because it happens in ordinary rooms. It happens when you decide not to send the long message you wrote in anger and instead sit on the edge of your bed, asking God to cleanse the motive behind your words. It happens when you apologize without using your pain as a weapon. It happens when you stop rehearsing what you would say if they finally understood you, and you give God the need to be vindicated. It happens when you open your Bible or sit in prayer, not because you feel holy, but because you feel desperate enough to stop pretending you can carry yourself. It happens when you choose not to fill the evening with noise, and instead let the quiet tell you what you have been running from. At first, this can feel unbearable. You may reach for your phone every few minutes, not because you need anything, but because silence makes your thoughts too loud. You may keep checking whether someone replied, whether an opportunity moved, whether the world has given you a sign that you are still wanted. Then, one day, after enough surrender, you notice a small change. You still feel the ache, but you do not obey it immediately. You still miss the person, but you do not chase. You still want the door to open, but you stop trying to pry it loose with anxiety. This is maturity forming in a place nobody applauds. God often develops spiritual authority before He gives visible influence, because influence without surrender becomes performance. You may think nothing is happening because there is no public progress, but heaven may be dealing with the private reflexes that used to lead you into the same cycles. The reflex to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. The reflex to accept crumbs because waiting feels risky. The reflex to call something God's will because you're afraid of starting over. These reflexes do not disappear through excitement. They are broken through quiet obedience, repeated when nobody sees. The hidden place is not glamorous, but it is honest. And sometimes honesty is the first miracle you are ready to receive. Betrayal has a way of making the noise louder before God makes the silence meaningful. When someone you trusted mishandles your vulnerability, your first instinct may be to gather evidence, defend your name, tell your side, make them feel what they made you feel. There are moments when truth must be spoken, boundaries must be set, and harm must not be covered with false peace. But there are also moments when God asks you not to let betrayal become your teacher. That is difficult because betrayal offers a strange kind of identity. It gives you a reason to harden. It gives you a story that explains why you should never trust again. It tempts you to measure every new person by the wound an old person left. Yet, God's removal of noise often includes removing the endless court case in your mind. You know the one? The imaginary conversations, the perfect comeback, the late-night replay of what they said, what you should have noticed, what you should have done. That inner courtroom can feel like control, but it keeps you chained to the person who hurt you. God may not ask you to pretend it did not happen. He may not ask you to reconcile with someone unsafe. He may not even ask you to understand why they did it, but he will eventually ask for access to the part of your heart that still organizes itself around the injury. Healing is not instant, and it is not a performance of being fine. Sometimes healing looks like deleting the draft you wrote at midnight because you realize it is not truth you want to send. It is pain looking for a target. Sometimes healing looks like crying in the car after a normal errand because a memory surfaced without warning. Sometimes healing looks like telling one trusted person the truth without turning it into a campaign. God's protection is not always preventing the wound. Sometimes it is preventing the wound from becoming your personality, and that protection may require quiet because you cannot hear his gentleness while you are constantly feeding the fire. Do not confuse this season with becoming unreachable, superior, or spiritually untouchable. That is one of the enemy's favorite distortions for people who are genuinely being refined. He takes a real separation and tries to turn it into pride. He takes real discernment and tries to turn it into contempt. He takes real pain and tries to turn it into a throne where you sit above everyone who failed you. But being chosen by God does not mean you are better than others. It means you are accountable for what you hear. It means you cannot keep blaming your environment once God has shown you the pattern. It means you are responsible for responding to conviction even when nobody else understands why you are changing. There will be times when someone's distance has nothing to do with spiritual warfare. They may be tired, they may be growing, they may be dealing with their own hidden battle. They may not have the capacity to show up in the way you hoped. Not every silence is an attack. Not every closed door is a divine warning. And not every uncomfortable feeling is the Holy Spirit telling you to run. Spiritual maturity gives room for nuance. It tests fruit over time. It seeks wise counsel without outsourcing obedience. It prays without forcing a conclusion. It watches whether peace grows or whether pressure increases. It notices whether a path draws you into honesty, patience, and holiness, or whether it feeds obsession, fear, and control. Later in this message, when you feel that one part of your life coming to the surface, leave a comment answering this one question. What noise did God have to remove before you could hear him again? Not for performance, not for attention, but because naming it may help you stop returning to it. Sometimes, the most spiritual thing you can do is tell the truth plainly. This friendship keeps pulling me backward. This desire keeps making me restless. This plan keeps requiring me to ignore conviction. This version of me cannot come to where God is leading. The clearer you become, the less you will need dramatic signs. You will still value confirmation, but you will stop demanding that God prove himself through constant emotional intensity. You will notice peace in places you used to overlook. A simple prayer before making a decision. A sentence from someone who had no idea what you were wrestling with. A door closing at the exact moment you were about to compromise. A strange calm after surrendering something you thought you could not live without. These moments may not impress anyone else, but they carry weight because they meet you in the exact room where you stopped pretending. God's message may come as a quiet conviction while washing dishes, when your hands are in warm water and your mind suddenly stops racing long enough for one clear thought to rise. You already know. It may come while sitting in the parking lot before going inside, realizing you are about to enter a place where you always leave less like yourself. It may come after a conversation that sounded polite but left your spirit unsettled, not because the person was evil, but because your role in that dynamic was built on self-betrayal. It may come through the delay that humbles you, the closed door that protects you, the unanswered message that reveals your attachment, or the empty weekend that shows you how much of your identity was built around being busy. When God removes noise, he also removes the excuses that noise made convenient. That is why Clarity can feel heavy at first. Once you see, you become responsible for what you see. Once you hear, you cannot honestly say you did not know, but responsibility is not a sentence. It is an invitation to live undivided. You do not have to rush the next step to prove you received the message. Sometimes, the first act of obedience is simply refusing to return to what God just made clear. No announcement, no dramatic explanation, no need to make everyone understand the holy work happening in you. Just a quiet decision made in the presence of God, followed by another quiet decision tomorrow. Eventually, the silence that once scared you begins to feel like shelter, not because everything is fixed, and not because every question has been answered, but because you are no longer afraid of what God might show you when the room gets quiet. You begin to understand that the removal was not random. The distance revealed dependence. The delay revealed motives. The closed door revealed protection. The heaviness revealed what needed healing. The loss of interests in old places revealed that your appetite was changing before your circumstances did. You may still be in the middle of it, still waking up with moments of ache, still learning how to pray without bargaining, still resisting the urge to reopen what God has been kind enough to close. But there is a steadiness forming underneath the grief, and that steadiness matters. It is not loud. It does not need to prove itself. It simply keeps you from betraying the clarity you suffered to receive. This is where the chosen one stops treating isolation as evidence of abandonment and starts recognizing it as a narrow room where God can speak without competition. Not every quiet season is holy, and not every loss is God's will, but when removal produces truth, surrender, healing, and a cleaner obedience, you should pay attention. God is not trying to make you impressive. He is making you listenable. He is teaching you how to hear without needing chaos to confirm the message. And when the right voices return, when the right doors open, when the right assignments become clear, you will not enter them as someone desperate to be chosen by people. You will enter them as someone who has already been met by God in the silence. That is the part many people never see. They notice when you become calmer, firmer, harder to manipulate, less available for confusion, but they do not know what it cost. They do not know that before you found peace, God had to remove the noise you kept calling life.